I'm sure it's not gone unnoticed that despite living in England, all of the episodes that have gone out thus far have been from further afield, aside from a single standalone about us driving to Scotland for a winter break. But having just done a handful of episodes on Shetland and Orkney, exploring a large number of ancient sites, both well-known and more obscure, it gave me pause, particularly thinking about what I consider to be normal or even common knowledge versus the general public's view of the same. This XKCD comic perhaps expressed this problem the best. Having spent the last few years first on Twitter, now Bluesky, almost exclusively in the company of history enthusiasts, the majority of whom are interested in Britain from the Roman back through Iron Age and earlier. Hashtag Hill Forts Wednesday, hashtag Standing Stone Sunday, hashtag Mosaic Monday. You get the idea. My internal calibration for what exactly counts as well known to the general public is way off, and yet for all my friends who are into this, well, I doubt that anything that makes this list will be completely unheard of. It's one thing if a singular barrow in the Dorset countryside is not widely talked about, but the larger ancient sites, particularly if masonry is surviving, well, unsurprisingly, they do tend to rise to the top. Anyway, there's probably no way to thread this needle properly, but I have attempted to compile this list of places around Great Britain that really deserve to be talked about more, but rarely are. If you're a normal member of the public, whatever that means in this context, unless you happen to live locally to one of these, I have serious doubts you'll have come across most or even any of them. If you're on Bluesky and part of the history community there, well, massive big ups. You are probably already aware of most, if not all of these, but stick around so you can then tell me what a rube I am in the comments, or maybe write something nice. That would also be nice. So, ground rules for this very serious and not at all arbitrary list. I said ancient. I realise that's a little vague. The sites we are looking at are pre-Roman, and as such, for Britain at least, fall largely before written history. Hence, could be accurately grouped as prehistoric. Problem is, you put prehistoric in the thumbnail, the public just assumes that you're talking about dinosaurs. So yes, we're going pre-Roman Britain, that's Iron Age, Bronze Age, Neolithic, you get it. You'll notice I said Great Britain in my intro. I'll leave it to CGP Grey to explain the precise subdivision and the various ways the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the British Isles, England, Ireland and Crown dependencies all intersect. To be honest, I'm also doing this because islands seem to have a major cheat code. We just got done doing Shetland and Orkney, both of whom have some of the most remarkable Neolithic sites on the planet. But just a reminder, this is a list of lesser known or underrated ancient sites, and Brodgar or Callanish or many of the other ancient sites, they're pretty well known. When you have floor-to-ceiling panels of them displayed at airports and ferry terminals, it somewhat breaks your claim of obscurity. I mean, hey, we could pretty much run this entire episode just purely based on the Neolithic in the Channel Islands. I mean, those barely ever get discussed, even with their size and significance. Yeah, though despite being within paddling distance of Normandy, they somehow managed to sneak onto the list of the British Isles, but part of the island of Great Britain they most assuredly are not. And hey, while we're up to this, we've also got some channel updates to talk about. Figured we could use this very algorithm-friendly episode to have a bit of a catch-up with all of you. But getting into the list then, number 9, this is where you're going to get an idea if we've gone too obscure for your liking or not obscure enough. Tell you what, let's do this by a show of hands. By sight, who amongst you knows where this is? For the hashtag Hill Forts Wednesday family out there, massive big ups. For everyone else, this is Old Winchester Hill, which paradoxically not that close to Winchester. I mean, 12-ish miles. This is made more funny by the fact that Winchester is overlooked by a pretty major hill fort. Feels like one of those cases where someone went for a domain name but was beaten to it. So if you see St Catherine's Hill sulking, you'll know why. But back to the actual Old Winchester Hill, it's a rather gorgeous univalate hill fort. Maybe it's too early for all the inside baseball. Univalate means it has a single ditch as opposed to multivalate like Badbury Rings. That would have made this list, but yeah, it's quite well known locally. This was a rather gorgeous January morning. Old Winchester makes for a great walk whatever the season, but what tipped it onto this list for me, not just that it's not widely talked about, but it also has another feature beyond its hill fort ditches. In the middle, you can see a set of barrows. These are Bronze Age burial sites, and it's a great demonstration of a phenomenon we see all over Britain. As the Bronze Age gradually passed into the Iron Age, we're also seeing a move to establish more firm control over the landscape. With structures like hill fort enclosures, it appears that people are displaying greater control and ownership of significant places. Sometimes this might be for military reasons, but in a lot of places, these enclosures are built around significant ritual sites that are much older, particularly barrows of various kinds. You can see this strikingly at Foel Dregan in Pembrokeshire in Wales. The later hill fort ditches are built around the earlier barrows, and while just levelling the barrows would both clear a bunch of space on the hilltop, but would also be a great source of stone for the walls or houses or whatever you like, and yet the barrows have very deliberately been left in place. Arguably, maybe Foel Dregan should be on this one list, but, well, there it is. Old Winchester Hill is another great example, an Iron Age hill fort built around an earlier Bronze Age barrow cemetery that clearly continued to hold significance. And just overall, Old Winchester Hill vibes are immaculate. I mean, what can I say? It's just a really nice piece of Hampshire and just well worth a visit. So how are we feeling so far? Too obscure or not obscure enough? Okay, well, number 8 is a second on the list for hill forts. This is not going to be just hill forts this episode, I promise. I was really torn which sites from Northumberland should be in the list. The area is incredibly rich in historic sites, yet doesn't seem to enter the conversation of ancient Britain anywhere near as often as other places further south. Yavering Bell was an early frontrunner, being both unbelievably large and the masonry of the original walls still being in situ. I just feel like it's relatively well known in the area. I don't know, again, how do I gauge what qualifies as well-known? I was contemplating Brock Law. There's a whole bunch of sites there in the Ingram Valley too, but I settled on this spot that has an extra card to play. Number 8, it's Lawdenshaws, and people seem to be equally split on whether that should have an S on the end or not. Now, the hill fort is impressive enough, a very nicely preserved multi-valley enclosure, which is all very pretty, but around this, if you go on a small hunt, or if you know where to look, it also has these rock art panels that predate the hill fort by many centuries. Neolithic rock art can be something of a demanding pastime, as you're often forced to go pretty far out and maybe dig through undergrowth for what can be fairly weathered and indistinct marks. But what makes them more remarkable is the distribution of these very similar techniques across a large area, particularly in Northern Europe. Cup marks are a name given to these rounds of dips. Was recently hunting around in central France and was pleasantly surprised at these, which were being beautifully lit even in the harsh afternoon sun. Ring marks are pretty much what they sound like, concentric spiral arts that maybe wouldn't be quite as much of a wow if they weren't so ancient and spread over quite a wide area, pointing to a clear transmission of ideas in a time that you might assume people weren't travelling as much. We've strayed from Lawdenshaws a bit, but these panels are unusually lavish in their sheer number of markings. I believe these are dated somewhat straying into the bracket of the Bronze Age. There's actually a lot of features in the landscape at Lawdenshaws. Some are more obvious than others. There's the remains of a Romano-British settlement to the southeast of the hill fort, and the remains of a barrow cemetery to the northeast, but you'll have a much harder time spotting those. Now, I've got to give credit to Alex Iles for getting me onto this one. We actually took a selfie here, but neither of us is looking our best. This is why I don't do commercial photography. My photos of actual humans generally come out horribly, but make sure to check out his stuff, since as far as the history of Northumberland goes, he's your guy. So yes, Lawdenshaws, not likely to have a BBC article written about it anytime soon, but well deserves a visit. Well, this next one was a tough call. I was this close to what feels like cheating, because the amazing Castle Henlys is built in the original archaeological footprint of the Iron Age settlement. I wondered about getting it on the list, but that would kind of open the door for somewhere like West Stowe for much the same reason, and while I adore reconstructed architecture, it is massively unfair based on the other items on this list having to survive 2, 3, even 5,000 years on their own without someone rebuilding them in the 20th century. So having gone back and forth, I was just repeatedly ending up back in Pembrokeshire. If you're not familiar, Pembrokeshire is essentially the Cornwall of Wales, a southwesterly peninsula jutting into the Atlantic that, also like Cornwall, is a gold mine for Neolithic sites. I had to get a dolmen somewhere on this list, and Penta Ifan would be a natural frontrunner, but it's pretty well known. It's quite an icon with its spiky orthostats. I think by a tiny margin and by virtue of its simply ridiculous surroundings, Carrig Sampson has to take the place on behalf of lesser-known ancient sites. It's kind of a proxy for all of the great ancient stuff in Pembrokeshire, which continues to remain out of the way by virtue of the roads. yeah, it's just, I mean, it's already a pretty long stretch as the crow flies, but as you get further west, the roads slow you down more and more. I mean, I did this back on an unusually sunny weekend in March, and the last stretch out of Carmarthenshire just seemed to take an eternity. But yes, Carrick Sampson, just on the edge of some farmland, but access is not a problem. And once you've had time to enjoy that and the incredible views of the Pembrokeshire coastline, if you've got your own wheels, it's not that far to Penta Ifan, also Clechi Drybed and Coetan Arthur, and so it's just a good day out catching a bunch of those. While we can put rough dates on these, it's tough to narrow it down to more than a few hundred years. It's not that we're being evasive, it's just that often the data just isn't there. You can't date stone straightforwardly. So yeah, putting a date of around 3000 BC is an approximate. I'll just be honest, making this list is a bit weird. The problem of going down a list where, for example, the Rudston Monolith and the Devil's Arrows, both some of the largest in the UK and incredible standing stone sites, both count as well known or well discussed, we are once again in the strange position of what does make the list then. A list that is not 67 sites long, but also, something I recently remarked on in our Orkney episode, you might be able to tell that we're pulling from a pretty large bank of our own footage with all of this. Footage that we've not really gone public with these last 6 years that we've been making episodes. We've put out some great ancient sites from around Europe and beyond, whether it's ancient Islamic sites in Andalusia, where we did our first episode, or Neolithic temples on Malta, Nabatean tombs in Jordan, Bronze Age Greece, pile-dwelling sites in the Alps, on and on. Now, we did these as travel episodes, kind of dipping into a little bit of the history, but primarily framing the whole thing of how we went about it, with no shortage of early starts, quick espressos, and low-angle flag shots. And actually, that's been just great fun. I thought a few years back that I'd probably stop filming all the in-between bits when we go places and just keep it to the ancient sites. And it quickly became apparent that was much less enjoyable. I've had fun documenting the quirky, trivial in-between bits, whether it's remarking on how good the coffee is, to various times when travel connections go awry and you end up on a 27-hour multi-coach, multi-flight, mad zigzag around Europe just to be reunited with your family. The big change, I guess, is that as a channel, we're flipping the ratio from travel channel that has an unusually high focus on ancient and medieval history to a history channel that prides itself on getting out quite far and wide. Our next big venture, as you may have already heard, is our series on hill forts. The very next episode on this channel is going to be the beginning of our hill fort series. If you'll permit us this brief trailer. To give you an idea of how long this has been in the works, I uploaded a trailer that stayed private, that in its closing fade to black said, beginning 2023. That was optimistic. So we've had so many episodes to get out ahead of that, and still a flood of sites that we've yet to see, but that is beginning very soon. We are still going to be doing some travel stuff too, but I'll catch you up on that in a bit. We've been going a bit long without going down the list. So, number 6... Okay, there are a great many long barrows that could go on this list. Maybe if you live in northwest Wiltshire, these feel very obvious. For anyone outside of the UK, perhaps not in the least. These are Neolithic burial sites that come in various forms and sizes. Some no longer especially prominent in the landscape. Others remained pretty mind-blowing for their size and ambition. I can't say if these are too well known or not. I mean, West Kennet gets a view from anyone who makes to Avebury, so that's too easy. And while we've been very fortunate to catch Wayland's smithy when it was on fire with autumn colours, I also feel that this is passed around a lot. So, speeding things up, I am too far down this rabbit hole, so I simply can't tell how much the UK population have any clue about this, but in the dead heat between this and Stony Littledown, that's very lovely and incorporates this fossil into its entrance portal, but Bellas Knapp, it's a bit harder to park. It's harder to reach, the hill climb is not inconsiderable, and while yes, it's had help with restoration after a second round of excavations between 1928 and 1931, its size and number of features, not just the main portal, visible here, but the chambers around the edge too. Most interestingly, the main entrance that the monument appears to be drawing you to is in fact a false entrance. Whether this was a deliberate deception to deter theft or maybe had spiritual significance as a doorway for the occupants, we're not sure, but there are actually 4 chambers around the edge of the monument. So of all the wonderful long barrows that make up the Cotswold 7 group, Bellasnap really is special and not especially straightforward to reach either. So yes, that's flying the flag for long barrows as a whole. Got a solid place on the list. Number 5, as part of this very serious list, which is very serious and not remotely a contrivance based on largely algorithmic reasons. Heavens forfend that literally every History Channel to break 5 figures of subs do that. No. Stone circles do capture the public's imagination, which is why the big players like Stonehenge and Avebury do not get a place on this list of lesser-known sites, and even Castlerigg, Swinside and Longmeg up in the Lake District, all a sheer delight and utterly unmissable, but yet pretty well-known, well-visited and pretty well-discussed. To go a step further but stay within stone circles that really wow visitors while somehow remaining under-discussed, I ended up in Dartmoor, and it pretty much had to be Hingston Hill. Now, Dartmoor is already punching way above its weight as far as Bronze Age and Neolithic sites go. Just tracing the hut circles and settlements around the edges is special enough, especially if you can get a view from above, but Hingston really stands out as one of the most incredible places in England that somehow is not as often discussed as it really ought to be. It is, as you can clearly see, not just a stone circle, but also a stone row, which just goes. Stone rows are much less cherished than stone circles. In Britain, we did used to have many more of these, but many are now just a few surviving stones of what were once vast ceremonial avenues. Dartmoor, again, punches way above its weight with these, from Cosden Hill to Assicombe and more too. But going for over 300 metres, I see different opinions on its total length. You've got to be impressed for its original construction, but also its survival. If you're not at Karnak, or possibly in Armenia, stone rows do not normally survive at this length. Dartmoor's inhospitability to farming across the centuries very much coming to its rescue here. Either way, it's well worth it. And while I'm not going to smuggle more onto the list, while we're at it, Yellowmead Circle is not all that far away and very much worth a look as well. Number 4, I really did go back and forth if this counts as too well known, but I reckon this just squeezes in under the radar in terms of the amount to see. If you go a short way outside of Inverness, yet the whole thing is not really walkable, but you can use the Inverness bus network to get you a little further out and then walk about an hour. It's the Clava Cairns. This is an incredibly rich Neolithic site to explore. As well as the 3 main cairns here, there's standing stones and other details too, like this ring mark. The Clava Cairns are of a particular type. They are oriented towards the midwinter sunset. Suffice to say, these trees were not necessarily there in the Neolithic. In fact, you can just take it as a given that the landscape would have been very different. Generally, they have an entrance passage, though some don't, and as well as standing stones around them, they also have these curb stones making up the edge of the monument. While this site has a lot to see and is just generally known as the Clava Cairns, technically this is the Balnuren of Clava, as Clava Cairns is the name of the type, and there are many more of these to explore in the countryside around. Not in quite as good condition, mind, but for example, nearby there's the Milton of Clava. The mound is clearly visible, though also clearly damaged, and there's also this standing stone. I was seeing this on a trip to Inverness and further over to Skye, and this never made it into an episode. I already mentioned that we've been keeping our powder dry with regards to the UK. To give you an idea of where we've done so far, there's this terrifyingly dense Google map of the various pins we've both done and are yet to do. But to put this in slightly more manageable terms, now, I am simultaneously embarrassed by this scratch map because it's like, oh, come on, dude, that's so basic. But then I also can't deny that I'm really into this. So what does that say about me? To summarise, we started by doing a lot in the Balkans, and particularly Greece, and other bits too. More recently, there was a Flixbus rampage, which helped us get a bit more of Central Europe. And later than we planned, we finally ticked off Germany, along with, a short time later, just a brief visit into Austria and even Liechtenstein. Other than that, a couple more of the Cycladic Islands, and also North Macedonia when we stayed around Lake Ohrid. And in just the last few months, finally, Denmark and Sweden in our first foray into Scandinavia. Of course, we've been up to a lot more besides, but once you've scratched off an entire nation, it biases heavily towards new borders. And also islands. This map somewhat ambitiously seems to think that people are going to be visiting Rockall, which, look, no one other than fishermen are scratching that off. So, if you look at the board, that leaves the perhaps puzzling omission of Portugal, but much more noticeably the Benelux countries, the Baltic, and the more inland countries of Eastern Europe, such as Serbia, Moldova, and Romania. All of which we do, of course, have plans, but there's only so much we can do, and despite the thousands of hours this has already taken, this is still undeniably our side hustle. But we are stepping up things with our shift over to more history series, and just to give you a peek, Hill Forts is now 10 days away, and given it's been about 5 years in the making, I'm actually kind of nervous. By the time that's made it across the British Isles, I want to catch up with some of our travels from the last 12 months, either Germany or Albania and some more of Greece, as well as Switzerland and Lake Constance and others besides. After that, and in pretty stark contrast to all the ancient stuff we've been seeing, our Venetian Republic series remains conspicuously unfinished. It's an unusual one for us, as it's pretty much our only area of interest much past the 1200s. Once we've completed that, we have a monster series on the Normans to go through, where again we'll be finally going through more of our journeys in the UK, but also out to France and southern Italy and more as well. And beyond that, well, the order is far from certain. I mentioned how much Neolithic stuff there is still to catch. Bronze Age Greece, I am dead impatient to catch with all the Minoan and Mycenaean wonders, but also Al-Andalusian Spain, Saxon England, and by the time all of that's done, then maybe I will finally have caught all the Roman stuff we set out to do, but can't help but chuckle. Recently, this platform has brought out an AI thing like, hey, would you like to brainstorm some episode ideas? I'm like, I have like a decade of episode ideas. Could you AI a way to make a 30-hour day so I can actually complete them all? It will hardly surprise anyone if at this point I ask you to subscribe. We're about 7 years into this journey already, but it's only going upwards from here, and I really want you guys to actually catch all of this. And if you want to make it all happen faster, bandcamp.com. You can support us there. We don't have a Patreon right now, but if you buy our music, which has been playing in the background this whole time, that would make all the difference. Okay, well, we really need to get back to the list. So, the top 3. This is Din Lligwy. The sharp-eyed will already noticed that I've bent my no islands rule by dipping across to Anglesey. But look, come on, I'm making an exception for Anglesey. Yes, it is an island, but man, it's so close and drivable. Come on, it's almost part of the mainland. For me, Bryn Celyn D is just too well discussed and wonderful. It's a fantastic place, but for this list of places you may not know about, it feels right to pivot to a settlement on the island that survives astonishingly well. And some of you, a small number of you, may have noticed we've actually been terribly naughty and broken another one of our stated rules. We set up top pre-Roman, and yet most of the activity we can date from Din Lligwy is from the 200 to 300s. It's believed to have activity earlier than this, so we can sneak it in on a technicality. But look, find me a site that looks less Roman. Really. And this, if anything, makes the place doubly interesting, because what you have is a continuity of vernacular architecture in a time where structures in stone are usually Roman rectangles. And yeah, while the site has some of that, it's undeniably closer in design to pre-Roman Wales, rather than, for example, a town like Caerwent, built by the Romans for Romans in an unquestionably Roman style. The round structures are believed to be dwellings, where the more rectangular structures are likely barns or similar. And there's a perimeter wall around all of it, and when viewed all together, it's a pretty impressive setup for a small farming community made with the local limestone. And while Anglesey has loads more that's worth seeing, there's a series of hut circles surviving at Holyhead on Tir Moor, but this is an incredible site to get a feel for the Iron Age into Roman Wales. Number 2, and by the way, I know we've all been around long enough to know what engagement farming looks like. You know, when someone says, oh, hey, comment on this. I'm so interested in what you have to say. It's like, sure you are. But I can't lie. Just coming up with this list and walking the tightrope of amazing but not too well known was just really good fun. So yeah, look, in the comments, why don't you try and come up with your own 9, or maybe even just 3 if you prefer. Sites that are worth a visit for ancient enthusiasts, but that are also kind of slept on, and that don't really get the appreciation. I am particularly laying this challenge for Depp, who's been amazing at supporting us for a while now, and not only is a fellow enthusiast for historic sites around Europe and the UK, but also does some incredible drone work. His stuff makes my aerial shots look like I've strapped a GoPro to a particularly lazy pigeon. So definitely show his channel some love. Okay, number 2, the downtrodden Brock. 2 Brocks. We'll get to it in a second. While I've made a reasonable go of Scotland, we've done a fair bit of the Borders region, some around Edinburgh, and to the north we've hit up the Highland 500 with more than a little bias towards Caithness, Orkney twice, Shetland, and also the Isle of Skye. Sure, there's more to do, but as we keep pointing out, this is a list of places you may not have come across. In the end, it came down to which Brocks would be on this list, and what really clinched it was that not only are these 2 in frankly remarkable condition, but they're barely a stone's throw apart, such that I can group them together as one site. And they're far enough out of the way that you really have to want to see them to get down there. I'm indebted to a good friend and much better photographer than I, who lives less than an hour away, and was generous enough not only to let me crash at his, but to take me down there. Please check out Sam Bose Photography to see how the Highlands are really supposed to be photographed. So what are we looking at here? Well, on an admittedly very rainy day in one of the rainiest parts of the UK, the Duntrodden and Duntelve Brocks. Brocks are already this unbelievable part of British history that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The fact that pre-Romans, the cultures living on the outer edges of Scotland were putting up these massive stone towers, eclipsing any other architecture that survives from the period. A culture that is thriving and undertaking an ambitious building programme. I mean, both on the sheer number of Brocks we're aware of and the community manpower it would have taken to put one together. You need significant resources to make this happen, let alone make several hundred of them happen. While we can't say for sure their function, the pendulum has been swinging away from them being primarily military. I mean, it's not a slam dunk, but at Duntrodden, for example, it's just hard to justify. If you're going to make a military installation, surely you take all your resources and make one fortress the most solid and impressive it can be. Placing 2 of these, both of which represent, major time and energy, 500 metres apart, just so they can't quite help each other out with overlapping fields of fire if an enemy attacks both, that just appears to make zero sense militarily. There's hints at potential use at Duntrodden. You can, for example, see holes where large wooden beams would have supported an upper floor, but more intriguingly, the facing stones on the lower floor are not as well finished as the upper floor, and one explanation would be that maybe the lower floor housed livestock while the upper floor was a domestic area. So yes, this list could easily have been mostly Brocks. There are a great many both on the mainland and on the islands, which are way more impressive than most of the surviving pre-Roman architecture we have in Britain. But of these, the 1-2 punch of Duntrodden and Duntelve, very worthwhile and hugely slept on. Okay, before we arrive at number 1, let's just blast through the sites that are amazing and should be on this list but are a little too cool for school to be considered underrated. So, Bryn Cadafana, this is often described as a stone circle. It's actually the remains of a cairn, and it's suitably far out and difficult to access that you wouldn't be at all surprised if this ended up in complete obscurity. But it's beloved by photographers, more than justifiably so, and as such, if you have an internet connection, good chance you've come across this one. Castle Henlis, we already mentioned. Literally just so many Brocks. I mean, a lot of the spots in Caithness would have been close contenders. Dorset's hill forts, that's literally our next episode, but Maiden Castle is already one of the most significant Iron Age sites anywhere in Europe. Badbury, really well loved, at least by locals, very much appreciated. Egerton gets less attention, but this was across the whole of Britain, so competition was fierce. So at least one of those probably deserved a spot on here, but we're keeping our powder dry for another week. We mentioned the larger stone circles of the Lake District, very popular and rightly so. Stanton Drew in the south would be another candidate for being just a bit too well known. People really love a stone circle. You have to be really geographically isolated to remain unknown. But okay, for our number 1, and summon Britney Spears because, oops, I did it again. Once again, we are looking at a structure contemporary with Roman occupation, but please, looking at Chisoyster, apparently that's how it's pronounced, you can see it is about as far removed as you can get from Corinthian columns and Opus Rectangularum. I mean, I joked earlier, find me a site that looks less Roman. Well, here you are. What we have are the remains of a Romano-British settlement in Cornwall, and yeah, we're pretty confident it had a pre-Roman 1st century foundation, so there's our excuse. But like Dyn Lligwy, as far as vernacular architecture, I mean, just look at this. If you can picture these a little taller with a thatch atop, there's 8 to 10 of these courtyard houses with separate rooms around the edge opening into this central courtyard. It does have a fugu, but don't expect access unless you have some very good friends at English Heritage. Of course, as anyone who knows Cornwall knows very well, this is not the only site of its type. Not only is Carn Uni also an amazing example of this type of settlement and has an absolutely banging fugu, but there are other more overgrown examples of settlements like this all over Penwith. Yeah, Penwith is just an unreasonably dense collection of both Neolithic and later Cornish monuments. But yeah, Chai's Oyster is quite singular as a place to see and glimpse an organised British settlement in the West Country. It also illustrates something that's still a real mystery. While the Romans were unquestionably in Cornwall, their presence is noticeably sparse. I mean, the last major Roman city you get to in the West Country is Isca Dumnoniorum, what we now call Exeter, and while the Roman roads do extend into Cornwall, and there's about 3 forts we know about, it's a very different picture to what you see elsewhere in the UK, where Romans would build these model towns as something of a statement of dominance. You can see life continuing, much in the same mould that it had before, no doubt benefiting from trade with the Romans, but it's another excellent example of the continuity of British life into the era of Roman conquest. And it's just a magical place to visit in general, especially on a sunny day. So, that's the list. I have no doubt that I've alienated the normal viewing public by pitching this too far over people's heads, while simultaneously putting this at too much of a normie scale for everyone who's thumbing through their 3rd copy of The Old Stones, because the first 2 ended up as ritual depositions in a bog. But to shine a spotlight on these places that the public likely doesn't know or talk about all that much, whilst also catching up on what we're up to, yeah, well, I've enjoyed myself. And since our Neolithic series will take, well, I can't even make a half-decent guess. I mean, even just trying to make a go of Neolithic Ireland could easily be a lifetime's work. It is at least nice to put out some of our footage for now. But as we teased, it is finally time to get our series on hill forts out. It's never going to be as fully complete as we like, but it's got to happen sometime, and that sometime is now. And so next episode, yes, no more delays, this will be our first in the episodes on hill forts, beginning in Dorset and then radiating outwards across the British Isles with plenty of surprises along the way. You can support us at bandcamp.com. We don't have a Patreon, but if you want all of this to go faster, that's the place to help us. Otherwise, follow us on Bluesky for much more Neolithic, Bronze Age, hill fort, Roman fort, church crawling nonsense, yeah, all of that. Otherwise, we'll see you for the first hill forts episode.